Long ago, when God Rosha had not yet been reborn, there were three great races. From the very beginning, they were in constant conflict with each other. The planet was inhabited by the Balor, the rulers of the New World. These creatures resembled ancient dragons, whose bodies were covered with strong armor of glittering scales. Their neighbors were the fairies, who ruled the elemental world. They were strikingly different from the Balor: light skin and hair, long ears, and graceful wings. All this made them completely different. The last race were the fearsome demons, the rulers of the magical world. They were distinguished by devilish horns, as well as a tail and wings, which gave them a frightening appearance. The three ethnic groups were in constant conflict, attacking each other endlessly. The end result was that the world was plunged into chaos and turned into an endless sea of war. One day, the world was struck by an unimaginable tragedy, the name of which is the Schism. This enormous catastrophe turned all existence upside down, destroying the usual order of things. Then people decided to stop the war. In this way, they managed to put an end to the shedding of countless rivers of blood that threatened to destroy all life. In confirmation of this, an unbreakable treaty was concluded. To protect the long-awaited peace, a majestic city called Sedition was erected. Three powerful and strong races worked tirelessly here for peace and prosperity. Our heroine was one of them, the Twilight Dragon Chrysaruadaki. Among the Balor, the girl was distinguished by her enormous strength. She was the only daughter of the Twilight Dragon race. However, the big problem was that her race did not possess magic. Due to the lack of mana, Chrysaorua did not study sorcery properly. Every time, all her efforts were completely in vain. From birth, the heroine was small and in poor health. Her parents constantly spent money to provide her with treatment and support. By that time, the girl was deeply disappointed in herself. However, over time, she discovered her talent for medicine, and her abilities were recognized in Sedition. When Chrysaorua woke up, she froze in complete shock, not believing her eyes. Mechanically covering her naked body with a sheet, she opened her mouth in amazement, not knowing what to think. Beside her lay three naked men, fast asleep. Their quiet snores filled the room, creating an atmosphere of strange calm. The girl couldn't believe she was in such a situation. At first she thought it was just a dream, but then, blushing, she remembered the events of the previous night. Chris looked at the things scattered on the floor and realized that all this really happened. Now she had one important and urgent matter. Finally, the heroine looked at the sleeping men once more. With annoyance, she realized that these were the same crazy guys she had encountered. All this happened in her laboratory. Chrysaorua continued to wonder how she had ended up in this situation. Then, still covered by the white sheet, she rushed to the long table. The girl couldn't just throw away all her efforts because of this incident. While exploring the surface in search of the necessary test tube, she decided to pretend that nothing had happened. Chris poured the blue, sparkling liquid from one container to another, determined to erase the men's memories. What had happened was a huge mistake that needed to be forgotten. The girl turned slightly, narrowing her eyes and raising her eyebrows indignantly. She soon came to the obvious conclusion that it was all the boy's fault. The heroine sighed heavily. To explain how it all happened, she would have to tell about the events of yesterday. The morning in Sedition was clear and cool. The square was already filled with people hurrying about their business. Street vendors were cheerfully laying out their wares. The aroma of fresh bread hung in the air. Chrysaorua moved quickly across the square. A man with a thick mustache asked her to check something. Without slowing down, she quickly assured him that she would do so. Behind her, the girl heard another scream. The woman said that she also needed her hands free. In a confident tone, she replied that she would be there soon. Chris wore a long white coat and high leather boots. In addition to the assigned tasks, she had an important task, so she asked everyone to wait a little. Our heroine was the Sunset Dragon. She decided to stop and catch her breath, sighing heavily. The girl thought with annoyance that she had been busy since the morning. The busiest time of the year had arrived. The reason for this was the ancestor honoring ceremony that was taking place in just a few days to celebrate the anniversary of the creation. It wasn't easy for Chris right now, but she knew she had to do her best. She wanted to show everyone what she could achieve in this place. Suddenly, Chrysaorua turned around when she heard a ringing sound. Realizing it was a phone, she knew someone was trying to contact her. On the go, the girl quickly pulled the phone out of her pocket and answered the call. A familiar voice came from the receiver, asking where she was now. Chris instantly knew who the voice belonged to. Hearing the lady after such a long time gave her immense joy. The woman quietly confirmed that they hadn't spoken in ages. Then she asked how she was doing and whether they were enjoying the holiday season. Chris Arua answered in the affirmative. She stated that she had completed her aid mission and research presentation a couple of days ago. Now all that was left was the ancestor honoring ceremony. The girl added that this year, the final ceremony featured the lands of the spirits of nature. The woman responded to her story rather dryly, but understandingly. After clearing her throat, Chris announced that she had some amazing news for the lady. She asked with interest what exactly she wanted to tell her. The girl's cheeks flushed. With embarrassment and joy, she declared that this time it was she who represented the lands of the gods at the ceremony. The lady started and expressed her surprise in a restrained manner. Chris Arua's smile grew even wider. She was delighted that she had finally managed to surprise her. The ancestral ceremony is the most important celebration in Sedition. Once a year during this event, those who have achieved outstanding achievements are awarded promotions. Usually, they were the ones who carried out the most important tasks related to the rift. The fact that Chris, without possessing magic, still succeeded seemed amazing. It's all thanks to her hard work this year, and the recognition of her accomplishments seems incredible, especially considering she didn't even receive any quests related to the rift. Carried away by the story, Chris Arua mechanically began to twist a fiery red lock of hair around her finger, waiting for her mistress's reaction. She only dryly noted that she had already heard about everything. The girl thought that praise from the woman would make her happy for several months. However, the next phrase struck her to the depths of her soul. Her mouth involuntarily opened in surprise. The lady asked if Chris had contacted Naskin. They had been inseparable as children, but after she had to leave the lands of the gods, they had grown distant and stopped communicating. Rumors of discord in the underworld reached Chris Arua, and it was said that the mere mention of his name sent shivers down the spines of those around him. With a hint of disappointment, the woman said she had no idea when the man would finally come to his senses. Chris noted that he had been a fairly sensible person as a child. It was obvious that Naskin had been ignoring the lady's calls lately. Now it was clear to the girl that she hadn't called because of her. The bright eyes drooped in despondency. Chris Arua explained that the boy had a lot of work to do, and she hadn't heard from him in a long time either. Perhaps it was because of the assignments he had to do with the rift. The girl shifted awkwardly from one foot to the other and added that she was completely useless there. Suddenly, a quiet sob came from the phone. The crying continued and it made her very worried. Chris tried to calm the lady down and asked if she was upset about Nascan. She told her not to worry so much. The girl promised that the next time they met, she would give him a serious reprimand and send him home. Then Chris Arua swallowed hard. There was only one way out. Clearing her throat slightly, she gently addressed the woman as Mom and asked her not to cry. The girl added that Naskin would definitely come to his senses soon. In any case, he was the lady's chosen heir and would soon become a lord. She said nothing. Suddenly, the woman turned to her daughter. Chris could tell from her voice that she had stopped crying and was genuinely happy. The lady's next words greatly surprised the girl. She said that she had something for her and added that she would receive it instead of Nascan. Since her mother had spoken of it personally, Chris Arua knew it was something very important. No matter how much of a scoundrel Naskin was, she didn't believe there was anything she could get for him. The girl agreed, saying that she would take it upon herself. The lady replied that in that case she would send the gift immediately. She decided to clarify the coordinates, and she quickly dictated them to her. Suddenly a blue glow flared up in front of the girl. Some strange fruit began to form smoothly from it. Chris, shocked by what she saw, began to ask what it was. She suggested that it could be the fruit of an unusual or magical tree. When the girl touched the gift, it was as if an electric current had pierced her. Vibrations passed through her body, causing a vague feeling of excitement, as if the object possessed great magical power. Suddenly, Chris Arua was transported to a vast desert. Looking up at the sky, she noticed a round black spot eclipsing the sun. However, there was still a bright light around. Suddenly, the sky cracked and long fissures glittered across its surface. A loud crack echoed across the vast wasteland. Soon, the cracks deepened, and unable to withstand the pressure, everything shattered into thousands of tiny pieces. Chris Arua watched with her mouth open, watching as the debris fell rapidly downwards. The girl's face was covered in cold sweat. Her fear was visible on every line. Then a powerful explosion was heard, and she barely had time to hold her breath in fear. Suddenly, a passing man bumped into Chris's shoulder. He turned around, rubbing his head, and seeing her frightened expression, apologized regretfully. The confused girl began to look around quickly. She realized with surprise that she was still on the cobblestone square of the city. Relieved, Chrysaorua pressed her hand tightly to her chest. She tried to comprehend what had just happened and make sense of what was happening. Everything that happened seemed completely unreal to her. Looking at the people around her, the girl realized that she was the only one who witnessed this event. Chris touched the magical fruit again with her finger, which was still hovering in the air. To her surprise, this time there was no strange reaction. The lady turned to the heroine, as if checking if she was still in touch. She responded and asked how she should keep this gift. The woman replied that the fruit now belonged entirely to Chrysaorua. She could do with it as she saw fit. The other woman's mouth just dropped open in surprise. Finally, the lady affectionately addressed the girl as daughter. She sincerely assured them that they truly loved her. Chris's eyes sparkled with joy. She was incredibly happy to hear these words and reciprocated. Then the family said goodbye and hung up. The girl held the magical fruit in her hands, looking at it thoughtfully. After some time, she decided to take it to the lab first. Chrysaorua hurried toward her research office, still wondering as she ran how she was supposed to store this gift. Suddenly, she stopped and began to sniff. The delicate and familiar scent was definitely coming from the flowers. Looking ahead, the girl noticed a group of fairy clan moving slowly. The smell was clearly coming from them. The men were walking cheerfully, animatedly discussing something. Chris was a little upset and even worried. Having studied the guys walking, she recognized one. She didn't want to cross paths with him at all. This arrogant man was named Sol Noctis. He was a representative of the lands of spiritual nature. Sol Noctis was the Fae who had achieved the highest results in all of sedition so far. He also played a major role in this year's ceremony. Suddenly, the blonde boy looked straight at Chrysaorua. His intense gaze made her feel uneasy and even scared. Without losing her composure, the girl smiled and waved her hand in greeting to her acquaintance. She still did not understand why their paths crossed now. The man raised an eyebrow with disdain and asked if she had any business with him too. Trying to justify herself, Chris replied that she was just happy, and that was why she said hello. He put his hands together and asked her what made her happy to see him. In an awkward tone, she explained that after the ceremony, the boy had to return to the land of the nature spirits. So most likely they will not see each other again. After a short explanation, Chris offered to say goodbye and politely extended her hand to the interlocutor. Sol Noctis nodded, looking at the girl, understanding flickering in his eyes. He was about to extend his hand in return, but something stopped him. Suddenly the man shook his head with a displeased expression and folded his hands together. He corrected himself by saying that he was glad he was leaving this place. Chrysaorua couldn't understand at all how he could interpret her words that way. Even if she expressed herself very clearly, he would invariably take it in his own way. Their relationship had long been strained. Chrysaorua knew she was largely to blame for it. Slightly embarrassed, she carefully pulled her hand away and smiled tightly. In conclusion, Chrysaorua reminded him that they would both be participating in the ceremony anyway. She suggested that he contact the lab if he needed help, assuring him that she would fulfill his request. However, the man once again looked away with displeasure, without answering. His behavior was driving Chris crazy. She didn't understand what he didn't like about her words this time. Suddenly, Lady Sunset was approached enthusiastically by other members of the Fae group. One of them asked for her help, and the other added that her previous cure had actually been effective. The boys noticeably improved Chrysaorua's mood. Smiling broadly, she happily agreed to help them and invited everyone to the lab when they had time. Not wanting to stay in this place any longer, the girl quickly said goodbye to everyone and ran away. Before she left, one of the guys told her to be careful. If Chris had lingered there for even a second, Sol Noctis would have certainly glared at her. Even as she walked away, she could still feel his disdain. The girl moved sullenly along the snow-white corridor. She thought that she had said hello in vain and had only wasted her time. Was it really so difficult for him to just say, "Thank you," at least once? Thinking about how rude Noctis was, Chris walked towards her lab. She suddenly stopped, noticing an unfamiliar man standing nearby. Chrysaorua noticed with surprise that no one should have been looking for her yet. Trying to see the stranger, she had a very familiar feeling. Then the man turned around and immediately recognized Sunset. It was Nascondarux, the Dragon of Dawn. The gentleman smiled broadly, greeting his acquaintance warmly. He genuinely asked how she was doing, clearly pleased to see her. The girl couldn't believe her eyes. There really was a dawn dragon standing in front of her. Chris asked excitedly what the man was doing there. Then she demanded an explanation as to why he had not answered the phone. The lady had been looking for him for a long time. To this, he replied that he had always been like this. Naskin said that no matter what, she should accept his gift. He noted that they had not had a drink together for a long time. Chris looked at the bottle in surprise and asked what it was. However, the girl's eyes suddenly sparkled. She wondered if it was Doskapel, which was hard to find in the lower world even for a lot of money. The man was amazed by his companion's knowledge. Chris Arua enthusiastically added that this was the only drink that could get dragons drunk, since they were immune to poisons. The girl decided to find out if Naskin had called her and the lady only because he was looking for this drink. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head and smiled. Chris studied the man carefully and looked at him intently, her mesmerizing eyes reflecting the desire to say something. Sunset noticed that Naskin had long since matured, but continued to grow. She admitted that she barely recognized him when they met. Looking at his interlocutor, he asked if she was still the same. Sighing awkwardly, Chris Arua sheepishly admitted that she was just a sunset dragon, so there was nothing she could do. The man said he was surprised because the girl was the same as before. He then added that she was still as beautiful. Chris was clearly embarrassed by this admission. With a slight giggle, she replied that the man was talking nonsense. Then Sunset awkwardly looked away. She was surprised that the habit of comparing herself to Naskin had become a common thing for her, and she couldn't get rid of this feeling. The man addressed his interlocutor in a serious tone, offering her a drink. She asked in surprise whether he really wanted to do it right now. The gentleman nodded confidently. Then he admitted that he had actually been looking for her to tell her something important. Chris looked at him in surprise, her eyes full of expectation. The man added that she definitely had to hear that. The girl frowned. She assumed that he was going to ask her to help him deal with some serious incident. When he didn't answer, Chris Arua suggested they discuss it in more detail over a drink. However, she needed to go into the lab for a minute to give him something. Naskin was incredibly happy with these words. He enthusiastically asked if she really had something special for him. The girl nodded awkwardly in agreement. She was confused by the fact that the man had not even paid attention to the mention of the mistress. Chris had already opened the door, and the gentleman suggested meeting later after she brought his gift. She briefly agreed, waving both arms joyfully. Naskin bid farewell to Sunset, giggling. She returned the farewell and disappeared behind the white doors. Entering the lab, Chris Arua settled herself comfortably at the table. The ingredients were laid out in front of her, and she began to prepare the healing enhancer with concentration. Then the girl looked puzzledly at the fruit that lay on the small table to her right. Her gaze softened, as if she were trying to solve its mystery. Chris thought she had seen many unusual medicinal materials during her studies. However, this was the first time she had seen this raft. Besides, it was not in the books. Forgetting about the potion, the girl stood up and walked over to a small table. Looking closely at the fruit, she tried to understand what kind of vision it was. Deciding to test how the fruit worked, Sunset tried to touch it again. That black sun and the powerful explosion seemed to be connected to the rift. For a moment, she was transported back to the vast desert. Debris was falling from the sky, shimmering in the bright light. It created a sense of destruction and chaos all around. Returning to the previous world, the girl suddenly lost her balance and fell, hitting the tray with the magic fruit. However, hitting the floor, the lady's gift broke. Chris sat there, shocked, unable to rise. Looking at the cracked fruit, she hoped that it wasn't important to the mission involving the rift. Sunset wondered if she should contact her mistress again. Suddenly, the air was filled with strange gurgling and hissing sounds. Looking at her desk, the girl's eyes widened in surprise. The glass flask had cracked, releasing a frightening chemical vapor. The next second, the vessel exploded with a roar, scattering shards of glass. Chris Arua desperately threw herself to the side, trying to cover herself. Her scream echoed off the walls. Slowly and carefully opening her eyes, the girl sighed heavily. On the table was a pile of shards and a boiling liquid that was emitting steam. She remembered that she was preparing an amplifier, but then she was distracted. Looking at the lady's gift, Chris realized that she was now in serious trouble. A sharp smell came from the split fruit, making her shudder. Then the girl's heart began to beat wildly, and a strange sensation came over her. She clutched her chest heavily, not understanding what was happening. The mood suddenly changed and Chrysarua's cheeks flushed red. Her body relaxed and she let out a long gasp, immersed in a new unexpected feeling. Sunset's heart was beating loudly and quickly as if it was trying to escape from her chest. She felt incredibly hot, and she felt as if a flame was engulfing her from within. Chris grabbed the workbench with a shaking hand, trying to get up. She assumed that the enhancer mixed with the fruit had caused this effect. She noted with annoyance that she had made a mistake. The girl sighed wearily again. Before the situation got worse, she needed to make a neutralizer. However, suddenly there was an insistent knock on the laboratory door. It was Naskin, who announced that he had returned and asked in a loud voice how much longer he had to wait. When she didn't answer, the man asked again if Chris had finished and asked for permission to enter, already pressing the handle. She told him to slow down. The girl ran to the door as fast as she could and slammed it. In a dismayed voice, she told Naskin not to come in. He shouldn't smell that smell. With a deft movement of her fingers, Chrysaorua locked it. Knocking again, the man asked in confusion why she had locked herself in so suddenly. Sunset told him not to ask and just leave. Then the girl rushed to the magic fruit and took off her long cloak. She needed to quickly block the smoke so that the situation would not get worse. As Chris got closer to the source of the smell, she felt herself getting even worse. A shudder ran through her fragile body, and a quiet moan involuntarily escaped from her lips. Naskin did not understand why he was told to leave and continued to knock persistently, asking for the door to be opened. The girl noted with annoyance that his actions would only attract more people. She wanted him to shut up, because if he showed up like that, he would be embarrassed. Sunset tried to assure him that everything was fine, but she stopped and gasped loudly. Her tone shocked the man. Chrysaorua tried her best to stop herself from shaking. She couldn't understand why Naskin's voice had suddenly become so pleasant. Her mind was going crazy thinking about him in such a light. The man continued to call out to Sunset, but his cries were interrupted by a confused voice. There was a stomping sound behind him, and the stranger noticed that they were making a lot of noise. The stranger was Axon Arc of the Demon Clan. Behind him stood Sol Noctis, his brows furrowed as usual. They asked what was going on here. Hearing more voices, Chris wondered who else could have come. Noctis asked what the noise was about and what Naskin was doing here. He asked what difference it made to him and said it was none of his business. Axon told the two to calm down and asked again what had happened here. Pointing to the lab, Naskin said that the girl working inside had dropped something. That's why she didn't want to open the door. Axon was surprised that Sunset was still there. Sol Noctis assumed that she was probably preparing for the ceremony, which was why she didn't respond. In an irritated tone, Naskin asked if he considered himself a know-it-all. The blonde firmly replied that he had an errand for Chrysaorua. Then he asked what business he had in sedition. Huffing with anger, the girl thought that if the men wanted to argue so much, they should have done it outside. She didn't understand why they had to make noise right next to the door. Naskin noticed that Sunset hadn't responded for a long time. Now they would have to break down the door. He added that she had been in poor health since childhood, so you never know what could happen. Axon Arc agreed with his words. Pulling his white gloves tighter, he said that he would open it with magic. It was dangerous for an outsider to touch the laboratory door. Suddenly, the magic holding the castle began to dissipate. The men shouted that they were going to enter. Unable to answer them, Chrysaorua only prayed that they would not enter. The door opened with a bang and 3 guys appeared in the passage. Axon, standing with his hand outstretched, continued to dispel the magic, and Naskin tensely examined the room. What they saw shocked the men. Sunset was on the floor on all fours, breathing heavily. Chrysaorua tried desperately to tell them to hold their breath, but she could only mumble something incoherently. She could no longer speak normally. The girl was supposed to be told, "Hold your breath, drink the neutralizer, and go home to rest." However, everything did not go according to plan. The 3 men were very confused by what they saw. They froze in the doorway, shocked by what was happening. Breathing heavily, Chris said that she was very hot, and then asked for a hug. A few seconds later, the excited boys began to shower the girl with compliments. Sol Noctis whispered passionately in her ear that her hair was as if dyed by the sun. He added that every time the sun disappeared behind the horizon, he thought of her. But alas, the sun was so high that his words of praise could not reach him. Gently embracing Sunset, the blonde said that kissing her was the highest honor. His words confused her to the point of madness, but at the same time brought her a sea of pleasure. Under the influence of the magical fruit, the men were like predators. They hugged and kissed Chrysaorua from all sides, excitedly whispering her name. Startled, the girl asked to listen. Naskin kindly replied that she could speak, although he did not realize that he had not actually given her the opportunity to do so. Axon gently touched her palm, leaving a wet mark on it. The sunset, overcome with conflicting feelings, called them all crazy. Lost in a warm kiss with Noctis, Chris began to doubt, her mind clouded, and her thoughts revolved around whether it was worth it to simply give in to her feelings and desires. Chrysaorua found herself once again in the vast desert. The black sun was splitting and deep cracks ran across the sky. The rumble from them was like thunder, foreshadowing catastrophe. The girl stood there, immersed in emptiness. The wind blew her long red hair, which swayed like flames in the still air. Hearing quiet footsteps behind her, Sunset slowly turned around, her face reflecting complete calm. What she saw made Chrysaorua slightly surprised. In front of her stood a man who was a dragon of dawn, and she recognized him immediately. He fell down, kneeling before her. With a sorrowful expression on his face, the man begged for a chance. His voice was full of despair and hope. The Dawn Dragon assured her that he would carry out any of her orders. He begged her not to leave him to his fate. The girl only chuckled slyly, smiling. The man added that even if she told him to become a dog and crawl on the ground for the rest of his life, he would do it without thinking. Chris replied that she would only think about it if he died in front of her now. The Dawn Dragon raised his hand with grim determination. Claws pressed to his throat, his eyes gleaming with courage as he prepared to take his own life. Suddenly, everything around her shattered into pieces, sweeping away everything in their path. Chrysaorua woke up, her heart pounding, shocked by what she had seen. She slowly sat up, leaning her hand on the bed. Sunset couldn't believe that what had happened was just a dream. Then, with annoyance, she noted that her whole body ached like hell. The girl, fingering a soft lock of hair in her hand, looked out the window where dawn was just beginning. Remembering the events of the previous evening, she turned around in panic. Chrysaorua froze in complete amazement, not believing her eyes. Mechanically covering her naked body with a sheet, she opened her mouth in shock, not knowing what to think. Beside her lay 3 naked men, fast asleep. Their quiet snores filled the room, creating an atmosphere of strange calm. The girl couldn't believe she was in such a situation. At first, she thought it was just a dream, but then, blushing, she remembered the events of the previous night. Chris looked at the things scattered on the floor and realized that all this really happened. Now she had one important and urgent matter. Sunset grabbed her head in despair and looked up at the ceiling with a scream. That's why she told the boys to leave. The girl suddenly remembered the fruit that the mistress had given her and turned around sharply. Looking at it, her eyes widened in horror. It was completely ruined, dark and wrinkled. What she saw gave Chrysaorua a headache. It had been so stupid to fail her mistress's task. She thought with annoyance that it was her power that had done the most harm to the fetus. Sunset glanced out the window and took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. The birds were already chirping happily outside. First, she had to sort this all out. Chrysaorua poured the blue sparkling liquid from one container to another, determined to erase the men's memories. She kept muttering that what had happened was a huge mistake that needed to be forgotten. As she stirred the liquid in the flask, the girl wondered why the men were not waking up. Then it occurred to her that they should sleep longer until she applied the medicine. Having finished preparing the potion, Sunset noted that it was enough for 3. Now she could definitely correct the misunderstanding that had occurred. Chris's first plan was to erase Soul's memory from Noctis. He looked at her askance every time they met. She thought it would be better if they got along in real life like they had the night before. The girl sighed sadly, remembering how well they got along as children. She couldn't understand why everything had turned out this way. Either way, Sunset would be incredibly embarrassed, so it was better for her to erase his memories. Then she brought the flask to his forehead and began to slowly pour the liquid. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Chrysaorua's head and she winced in pain. She groaned with difficulty and sighed heavily, feeling weakness wash over her like a wave. Then the girl felt very dizzy and everything around her started to blur. Images and sounds mixed into a vague mass, as if the world around her was losing its clarity and shape. The next moment, Chrysaorua found herself in a very familiar place. It was the dragon castle she had once lived in. Memories of it flooded her. Suddenly, someone reached for her wrist and then grabbed it tightly. The stranger's hand squeezed it so hard that it almost went numb. The man was Sol Noctis. He looked at the girl with his mouth wide open, his face filled with grief and injustice. Tears were streaming from his bright green eyes. As if overcome with grief, the man grabbed Chrysaorua by the shoulders and kept screaming. However, she could not hear what he was saying. Her arms were hurting badly from his tight grip. After that, Sunset woke up. Still clutching her head, she continued pouring the magic potion onto Noctis, not looking up from her work. Realizing her actions, Chris instantly pulled the flask away. Panic showed on her face and she froze, not believing what she had done. The girl looked at the bottle in amazement. There was only enough magic potion left for one person. She looked at the two lying guys and wondered which one to choose. Her anxious gaze continued to dart from one to the other, not knowing which one to stop at. Looking tensely at the snoring Naskan, Chrysaorua thought that there was nothing she could do. She would explain everything to him later, but for now she would use the rest of the potion on the demon. Holding the flask to the man's head, the girl realized that the potion might not be enough. He might perceive it as a dream. In desperation, she began to pray for the potion to work. However, Axon suddenly grabbed Sunset's wrist, not letting her spill a drop. She froze in fear, not knowing what to do next. Chrysaorua realized that she had completely failed, and a cold sweat appeared on her forehead. With difficulty focusing his gaze, the man turned to the girl with sleepy and uncomprehending eyes. Axon scratched his head awkwardly, trying to remember what had happened. When he saw the two naked and sleeping men, everything in his memory seemed to immediately fall into place. Looking at the embarrassed Sunset, the man noticed many bruises. He asked if it was really him who left such marks on her skin. Still realizing what had happened, Axon blushed deeply and tried to cover himself with his hands. Sweat from embarrassment and excitement appeared on his face. The man muttered in shock that he definitely couldn't have done such a thing. Chrysaorua looked at him with a piercing gaze, thinking that he was the one who started it all. The demon began to search for his things in a hurry, finding them one after another. The girl tried to calm him down, noting that he was not the only one who left these traces. Sunset noticed the boy trembling and turned to him in fear. The next moment he threw on his cloak with lightning speed and ran out of the lab. Chrysaorua only had time to shout discontentedly after the guy, and then desperately grabbed her head. The door slammed shut with a bang, and she couldn't understand why everything couldn't just disappear. Trying to overcome her inner anger, the girl began to calm herself with words. Tightly clutching the flask with the remains of the potion, she firmly decided to use it on Naskan first. Sunset rose energetically, full of determination. She knew that she was quite capable of dealing with one guy. First of all, Chrysaorua took on Sol Noctis. After some time, she completed the task. Exhaling heavily, Chrysaorua began to massage her shoulder. The man was so heavy that she almost dislocated it. She hoped that his sleeping in the restroom would not arouse his suspicions. As she left the room, Sunset glanced at the sleeping boy. She was worried that he had taken too much medicine. She hoped that he would be okay. Chris stared at Noctis and noted his attractiveness. However, she soon closed her eyes in displeasure, believing that such thoughts would not weaken her will. Slightly embarrassed, the girl decided to quickly leave. Now she had to deal with Naskan. Puffing heavily, Sunset pulled the man out of the lab with all her might. He was too heavy for her. That was why she kept telling him to stop swinging. Chrysaorua angrily slapped Naskan across the face, not holding back her strength. She was irritated by the fact that he had suddenly gotten drunk. Stopping and trying to catch her breath, Chrysaorua adjusted her long hair. She realized that she definitely wouldn't be able to drag him this way. Suddenly, the girl decided to open her huge red wings. They spread out with a powerful rustle, illuminating the space with a bright crimson light. Chris had no desire to stretch out these sunset wings. She considered them too small and completely useless. The girl grabbed the man's back and easily flew into the air. She laughed and couldn't believe how far she had come. After some time, the pair reached the secret lair of Chrysaorua, located outside of Sedition. The entrance was a giant hole in the rock, sealed with a massive golden seal. Sunset carefully laid Naskan down on the bed, and he immediately began to snore. All this time, the man continued to sleep soundly, not awakened by her actions. Chris sighed wearily and brushed the dust off her sleeves. Frowning slightly, she realized that she had done all she could for now. The girl sat down on a wooden chair, folding her hands together and throwing her head back. She was a little worried about the fact that Axon Arc had disappeared along with all his memories. However, Sunset knew that the man should not make unnecessary noise. What worried her most was something else entirely. She could not get rid of thoughts about the fruit that the lady had given her. Because of yesterday's circumstances, he was completely broken. His girlfriend was entrusted by her own mother personally. She did not know how she should act in this situation. Frustrated, Chris pulled her phone out of her pocket and thought about calling the lady. Staring into space, she wondered if she should do that. Suddenly, the girl was overcome with memories from her childhood. They always tried to calm her down, assuring her that everything was fine, even if she couldn't do anything. The woman often said that Chris was beautiful just the way she was. She had to be careful not to get hurt or sick, taking care of herself and her well-being. Sunset answered sadly that she also wanted to do something on her own. Although she had no magical powers, she hoped to find something that could captivate her. The woman stroked the girl's head gently, and she looked down hopelessly. She told them that they already loved her, and she didn't need to strive for the unattainable. Chris couldn't help close the rift. Despite that, she was here to get credit for the results she had achieved. Sunset pressed her lips together sullenly, tormented by the thought that she had failed to keep the thing that had been given to her only one day before. Then the girl remembered the lady's words that you could do anything with the fetus. Putting the phone on the table, she realized that she had long forgotten about one feeling. Chris looked down at the floor, dejected. She had forgotten all about her sense of uselessness. Suddenly, Sunset heard a muffled sigh behind her. Curious, she turned around to find that Naskin had finally woken up. The man looked at Chris with sleepy eyes, and his mouth hung slightly open. His face was rumpled and tired, his hair was tousled, and his expression showed that he had not yet fully recovered. The girl turned to Naskin, but at that moment he suddenly screamed and jumped up. His eyes opened wide and his mouth opened in a loud scream. Krisarua chuckled and asked what had scared him so much. She suggested that he had seen some kind of scary ghost and giggled. The man shook his head, then looked away awkwardly and asked if this was her lair. His cheeks flushed bright red. With a slight stutter, Naskin noted that the girl had a really nice lair. She snorted, telling him not to talk nonsense. She knew very well how terrible it looked. Krisarua poured the boy some orange juice and he asked how he got there. She noted that he was still not awake, and then asked if he really didn't remember anything. Seeing the deep surprise on Naskin's face, Sunset realized that her medicine had worked. The man took a small sip and his gaze filled with excitement again. The girl rolled her eyes and sank down onto the bed. She said that the gentleman had gotten so drunk yesterday that he couldn't walk, so she had to bring him here. In a condescending tone, Krisarua continued that Naskin had passed out immediately after drinking. She did not believe that dragons could get drunk. Then she added that it was all the fault of the lower world alcohol. The man awkwardly agreed that she was right. Still confused, he continued to look at Sunset. Naskin noted that she looked tired, and then noticed a bruise on her neck. Suddenly, the man jerked, shaking his head and spilling some juice. Chris asked why he was sitting so strangely. Then she added if he had been dreaming something bad. The girl leaned her elbows, resting her cheek on her palm in an intriguing manner. In a suspicious tone, she asked if he had had an erotic dream. Naskin's cheeks flushed bright red with embarrassment, and he immediately began to make a confused excuse. His words were jumbled and his voice trembled. Looking away, the man tried to compose himself. Finally, he answered hesitantly that it was just an ordinary dream. Then, with obvious embarrassment, he thought that it had been slightly erotic after all. Chris frowned in displeasure, not understanding what exactly he could have dreamed. Her gaze became cold and her eyebrows knitted together, expressing obvious indignation. Suddenly, Naskin announced in a cheerful tone that it would start raining tomorrow. There was clearly false enthusiasm in his voice. However, Sunset merely barked at him not to try to change the subject. Then she asked suspiciously if he used his powers to predict the weather. Krisarua asked when Naskin would return to reality. He just chuckled nervously, scratching his face. The Dawn Dragons represented the light of hope. From the moment of their birth, they were imbued with the power of great prophecies. The current leader was also a Dawn Dragon. She brought Naskin when he was still a child and raised him as her future heir. His magic was extraordinary and rapidly developing. The man controlled it perfectly. However, despite his good reputation, at some point he began to have troubles. He abandoned his work related to the rift and became interested in entertainment. Naskin often used his excellent abilities in debates. He did not even listen to the advice of the elder dragons. The last task he had done carefully was to guard Chrysaorua when she lived in the lands of the gods. However, the man had rebelled even against that. Now, everything was completely different. All his life, Naskin carried out his tasks with detachment, as if he felt no emotions. Sunset did not like having guards assigned to her, so she always avoided him. The girl had no idea that they could become friends. She noted that it was for the best for her to have such a precious friend. Chris looked at Naskin and asked if he could listen to her request. The man nodded, wondering why he couldn't listen to her. At the same time, he prayed that this wasn't a task from the mistress. Sunset asked calmly if he could perform the ceremony in her place. Not expecting such a question, the man spat out all the juice, staring at her in amazement. Naskin asked again if she had made a mistake in her words. The girl nodded confidently and added that since he had already imagined the lands of the gods on her, he could do it now. The man awkwardly stated that it was the work of Chrysaorua. Sunset, with a light laugh, noted that she wanted to brag about it yesterday when they were drinking. Naskin waved his hand and asked who the lady thought he was. He pointed out that she was mistaken in thinking that he would agree without hesitation. Chris clarified that it was her personal request. Upon hearing this, the man immediately declared that he would fulfill her request. He giggled and explained that the girl had seen him participate in the ceremony, which is why he trusted her. With an awkward grin, Sunset realized that Naskin only listened to her. That was why the lady decided to hand the fruit over to her. Standing up, she said that she had urgent business. Remembering something, Chrysaorua asked if the boy had a request for her. Clearing his throat, he replied that it was unimportant at the moment. Turning slightly, the girl noticed that he had been looking for her until the night. This meant that he definitely had something important. With an awkward chuckle, Naskin explained that he just wanted to have a drink together. As she was about to leave, Sunset gave him a suspicious look. The man thought that he had completely forgotten about it. Naskin looked down and addressed Chris delicately. But she didn't even listen to him. Her face suddenly flushed bright red and she hurried to the door. Having calmed down, the girl put her hope in the man, since there were only a few days left until the ceremony. Pointing her finger at him, she told him to clean up her lair, since everything had turned out this way. Naskin scratched his head awkwardly and couldn't refuse. However, Chris's next words made him freeze in surprise. She said that she was very happy to have such a friend. The girl heard only a dry uh-huh from the man's lips. Looking at him, she noticed that his expression reminded her of something. She wondered if she had seen this before in a man. Turning sharply, Chrysaorua hurried out of the room. She tried to push such useless thoughts away. Only Naskin remained in the room, his face drooping with grief. His eyes were dull, his forehead wrinkled, and his lips pressed together. His gaze was empty, as if he was struggling with unspoken pain. It was raining outside. The drops were quietly tapping on the glass, creating an atmosphere of melancholy. Chrysaorua sat in the laboratory, racking her brains over what to do with the lady's fruit. The girl fell desperately onto the table, feeling helpless. She supposed that she should go to the lands of the spirits of nature and find a new fruit. The medicines that Sunset had ruined could not be remade right before the ceremony, which is why she asked Naskin to take her place. To complete her mistress's errand, Chrysaorua needed to find the fruit. She also needed a high-ranking fairy, as she planned to visit the lands of the nature spirits for personal reasons. Tears rolled down the girl's cheeks as she stared into the void. It wasn't easy to get there, and she didn't know who to turn to for help or what to do next. Sunset sobbed heavily, trying to cope with the overwhelming emotions. The only person she could think of was Sol Noctis. Not wanting to keep all the stress inside, she decided to go for a walk. Walking in the rain in the Central Park, Chris unexpectedly met a familiar person. Sol Noctis was sitting on a bench, his head down sadly. Frowning slightly, the girl assumed that he was having side effects from the medication. She noticed that she had overdone it a bit with the dosage. As Chris approached, she noticed with irritation that she had been embarrassed for no reason. She asked the guy what he was doing there and whether he should have been preparing for the ceremony. He just remained silent. Sunset asked in a displeased voice if Noctis had even heard her. He glanced at her from under his brows and in a callous voice told her not to bother him. Turning away, the guy hung his head again. The sharp answer discouraged the girl, who was worried about him. Frowning, Chris left, realizing that he was going to ruin the ceremony. Back in the lab, Sunset slammed her hand down on the table. She couldn't believe she didn't have any fairy friends. Her job now was to find one. A few days later, Chrysarua's attempts were unsuccessful. She sat sadly in the dining room because absolutely everyone refused her request. All the fairies seemed harmful to her, as they only communicated with each other. The girl was irritated by their indifference and isolation. There was a stomping sound from the hallway. A group of men were discussing the upcoming ceremony and did not believe that Sol Noctis could introduce them. One of them suggested that he would definitely ruin the ceremony. One statement caught Sunset's attention. The long-haired boy said that nothing more could be expected from the representative of the Dry Branch. The fairies were divided according to the level of their magical abilities. Among them, the representatives of the Dry Branch occupied the lowest rank. It was determined only once and therefore could not be changed. Chrysarua knew of only one fairy who had left Dry Branch through hard work. No one else had ever done it. She thought that perhaps the Dusk Dragons, born in the lands of the spirits of nature, became Dry Branches. Although there was a significant difference between the lands of the gods and the spirits of nature, the group of boys continued to discuss Noctis heatedly, noting that he had not prepared for the ceremony at all. However, seeing his menacing face every day, they preferred not to interfere. The men said that such a person did not fit into sedition. Feeling unwell, Chris tried to get up from the table. When she got up, she could barely stand on her feet due to severe dizziness. The girl assumed she was simply overworked. She had always been warned about her poor health. Suddenly, she staggered and covered her mouth, trying to hold back a wave of nausea. With a thud, Chrysarua leaned her elbows on the table. All the boys in the group turned around, looking at her in confusion, not knowing how to react. One of them asked why Miss Sunset was there. Then he changed the subject, talking about something incomprehensible and some guy from the demons. The girl didn't understand what he meant, because just a minute ago they were all cursing at the Dry Branch. Not wanting to stay in this place, she decided to go to the laboratory. Turning around, Chris was surprised to the depths of her soul. Axon Arc, a representative of the demon clan, entered the room. The girl covered her mouth with her hands again, not understanding why she suddenly felt so sick. Waves of nausea rolled over her, and she tried to figure out what was happening. The disgruntled fairy began to shout that the demon should not have been there. He added that even Lady Sunset vomited at the sight of his face. Confused, Chrysarua tried to explain that this was not the case, but she failed. The men continued to complain about the presence of demons in Sedithian. They believed that the clan that started the war should not be here. If we recall the old days, defeating the lands of evil spirits was not enough. The girl understood that the group wanted to change the topic from their gossip about Noctis, but they were overdoing it. She admitted that there was truth in their words, but if they continued in the same spirit, they would receive a reprimand. At the end, the irritated fairy remarked that the demon should consider it an honor to be able to walk around so brazenly. The demon only looked at him skeptically. Axon Arc chuckled and asked if those guys were racists. They only winced, and he clapped his hands and grinned, noting that they had made an excellent choice. The man added that in order to pull out one weed, the boys decided to burn down the entire forest. Gritting their teeth, the fairies suspected that he had chosen the metaphor with plants on purpose. Clutching her head wearily, Chrysarua approached the group of boys and asked to see their IDs. She added that things were getting serious and she couldn't stay away. Faye was a trainee of the Second Guard of Scaled. Scaled was another name for the family tree of the head of the lands of the spirits of nature. This meant that their status was higher than the girl assumed. The Sunset Lady declared that all the boys would be severely punished. They hung their heads guiltily, and their faces no longer expressed their former confidence. Looking at the demon, Chrysarua said that he would not go unpunished either. The man raised his eyebrows in surprise, not believing his ears. Then the girl ordered him to follow her. Arriving at the lab, Sunset began to make some kind of potion. Looking at her from behind, Axon Arc asked what kind of punishment was intended for him. While stirring the liquid in the container, the girl explained that she had not yet decided. However, she warned that the punishment would be really severe. The man stated that interclan racism was forbidden in Sedition. Chris responded that the fairies were also unaware of her presence and had made a mistake when they found themselves in a desperate situation. Some time ago, the demons broke the peace treaty concluded between the three clans and started a war. Having lost in the end, they lost their lands and were subjected to universal humiliation. Discrimination was formally prohibited in Sedition. However, in practice, this rule was often violated and was far from being properly observed. Unable to contain herself, Chrysarua sighed heavily due to her headache. Axon Arc noted with concern that she looked bad. The girl explained that this was why she was making the medicine now. The Sunset Woman explained that she had gone to rest, but suddenly everything inside her had turned upside down. She sincerely did not understand why she was being subjected to such torture. The man thought for a moment. Axon Arc looked thoughtfully at Chris and suggested that he had given birth to life in her. She, hearing this, froze in surprise, as if she could not believe her ears. With a disgruntled snort, Dusk noted that the Dusk Dragons were unable to give birth. The demon asked if it was congenital sterility. She shook her head and replied that the chance was extremely low. The man said that such a possibility still existed. He suggested that she check it out, but Crisarua continued to insist on her opinion. Looking at the finished medicine, the girl said that the demon irritated her. Frowning, she added that her head was splitting precisely because of him. Sunset was about to take the potion, but Axon Arc grabbed her wrist. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. The man said that the medicine could have had a negative effect on the woman in labor. He grinned and asked the girl to get tested, if only for the sake of his reputation. Crisarua noted with displeasure that he was too impudent. Realizing that the demon would not leave her alone, she began to look for a pregnancy test. He only smiled contentedly. Having found the necessary object, Sunset looked at it skeptically and excitedly. She needed to direct her magical energy into it, and then the result would be visible. After channeling a little mana, the crystal ball began to sparkle. Around it, one golden ring and one fuzzy ring appeared. 2 lines formed, indicating that 2 energies were resonating in the body. The couple looked at the ball carefully and came to the conclusion that Crisarua was pregnant. She frowned thoughtfully. In a calm tone, the girl said that in any case it didn't matter now. She added that she wanted to say something to the man. He was all ears. Sunset pointed at the torn-down door in a nasty tone and ordered Axon to compensate for the broken hinges. Smiling awkwardly, he assured her that he would compensate for everything. After searching his pockets, the man said that he did not have any suitable currency at the moment. He added that he only had precious stones. The girl immediately agreed. Suddenly, Crisarua's eyes lit up with delight. Axon Arc pulled out the insurgent diamond ring. She couldn't understand how he had managed to get hold of a stone that suited her taste perfectly. Realizing what was happening, Sunset pulled her hand back in a flash. She asked indignantly what he was doing. Smiling broadly, the demon said that he was simply handing her a stone. Chris angrily replied that he should have just given the stone back. She asked why he had put it on his ring finger. Axon Arc noted that if dragons had a child, it had a birth name. Sunset frowned and glared at him, stating firmly that the child would not have that. The man thought for a moment and tensed slightly. Then he suggested giving the child a postnatal name. The girl looked at him with disdain. Crisarua, folding her hands in displeasure, asked why he was so upset about the matter. She added, with obvious irritation, that it was not he who had conceived the child. Axon Arc smiled and noted with a hint of irony that it was not exactly known. However, in his opinion, he was the one responsible for the unborn child. Axon added that if he hadn't broken down the door, none of this would have happened. The girl sighed and noted that ideally they should investigate everything in detail, because his paternity is only a possibility. Crisarua asked if he realized the enormous energy needed to birth a dragon. She pointed out that a dusk dragon like herself did not have enough of it. Sunset grimly noted that even if she managed to give birth, nothing good would come of it. However, Axon, as if not listening, asked whether she would give the child a name if she still wanted to. The girl decided to end this conversation, because in any case she was not going to give birth. At the moment she had a lot to do, so she did not want to worry about it. After a short silence, the man declared that Mrs. Crisarua had wounded his soul. She looked at him in bewilderment, her eyes expressing complete incomprehension and slight confusion. Unbuttoning the button, the demon said that Sunset had seduced him that day. He asked if she was going to use him and then just throw him away. The demon added ironically, was it possible that the girl had been disappointed in him on the first try? Suddenly her cheeks flushed, and in a trembling voice she asked when she had seduced him. Enthusiastically unbuttoning his shirt, Axon Arc approached Crisarua closely. He stated that she had used not only words that evening, but also rather seductive actions. The girl's face was distorted with confusion and panic. Calling the demon crazy, she asked when she had taken his clothes off. Anxiously trying to remember, she began to think she was crazy. The man spoke kindly to Chrysaorua again. He informed her that she needed high-level magic to give birth, and suggested that it could be supplemented with someone else's. Chrysaorua stammered that she wasn't sure, her eyes full of worry staring at him. Axan Arc, looking at Sunset closely, offered to check it out with him. He noted that he understood how pregnancy could affect her health. The demon suggested that his help could ease her condition, and then the headache would go away. He also added that in this case she would not have to take medicine. Chrysaorua asked why he was just throwing it indiscriminately. He smirked and asked if she realized what he was getting at. Looking down, she quietly replied that she didn't really. Axan Arc came closer and lightly hugged Sunset. Her knees trembled. Without saying a word, she only looked into his eyes, waiting for a kiss. The man approached and sniffed her hair, noting that she had a pleasant scent. Addressing her as Chris, he saw her surprise and explained that this was what others called her. The girl thought that only the mistress and Naskin called her so affectionately. Breathing heavily, she reported that the demon continued to brazenly cross the line. Sunset grabbed his neck tightly. Axan Arc, addressing her politely, asked if the services he had rendered were still not enough. Completely surrendered to her feelings, Chrysaorua told him to call her whatever he wanted. Then the couple reunited in a deep kiss, as if they were one. Mana filled the girl and the headache gradually receded. If she really managed to accumulate enough mana this way, perhaps even the dragons of the sunset would be able to bear children. In a dream, Chrysaorua saw a man who said that even if the sun did not set in the middle of summer, or did not rise above the earth in winter, it would be in her power. In the end, the stranger clearly said that the girl was made for love. These words were the most sensual and pleasant that she had ever heard. The man ran, breathing heavily, his breath ragged and hoarse. Blood trickled from his mouth, staining his lips and chin, giving his movements a special tension and fear. Axan Arc ran away desperately, his face and body distorted with fear. A wooden arrow protruded from his back, increasing his torment and making his movements even more abrupt and chaotic. A huge group of Fae chased after him, shouting loudly as they went. Their commander turned to the Skaldgard and ordered them to prepare their spears. The strong, long-haired warrior swung his arm and, gathering all his strength, threw the spear. His movement was powerful and precise. The spear, sparkling, flew swiftly towards the target. Although Axan Arc ran with all his might, the weapon was faster. It pierced his stomach from behind and he let out a painful cry. The spear that pierced his back was followed by 2 more arrows that penetrated deeply into his body. The man, unable to bear the pain, fell to all fours. Blood flowed from his mouth, staining the ground. A familiar voice hissed bloodthirstily that Axan Arc had finally run out of time. He only managed to glance at the Fey warrior in the end. His violet eyes glowed brightly, reflecting a menacing glow. Then Chrysaorua woke up and gasped in surprise. The man was carrying her on his back. She looked around and asked where they were. Looking at the girl's frightened face, Axan Arc calmly replied that they were on their way to her lair. He added that everything would be fine and they would arrive soon. Sunset grabbed her head with her hand and thought. What she had seen earlier turned out to be a dream, and she could not understand what it meant. The dream was so realistic that Chris actually thought he had just been killed. She suggested that perhaps she had been overly sensitive. The man, noticing her strange voice, asked if everything was okay. She replied that she had just had a stupid dream. He added that in the early stages of pregnancy they could be ominous. Chris noticed that she seemed to have slept for a long time. She assumed that the demon had difficulty carrying her because she was so heavy. He replied that the lady was lighter than a feather, and she sheepishly told him to shut up. Looking at Axan Arc, Sunset thought that he had arrived in Sedition not much later than her. She decided to ask the boy for what purpose he had come to this city. The girl added that demons were rare in Sedition, and he had not received any assignments related to the rift. He did not answer immediately, gathering his thoughts. The task of eliminating the world rift was a way to fulfill the duties of the 3 blessed clans. The wisdom of the world was passed down from generation to generation in the demon clan. After losing the war, they lost their blessing and the lands of evil spirits were wiped off the map. The remaining demons moved to the lower human world. After the loss of the blessing, the demons were relieved of the duty of closing the rift. Accordingly, their presence in Sedithian was truly significant. Axan Arc started that several demons should come to this city from the start. In any case, He believed that the set of groups protecting the world should be equal. In response, Krisarua nodded thoughtfully. The man added that, according to the information available about the rift, it was in this direction that it was spreading the slowest. Stopping, Axon grimly informed them that the underworld was the last place they were allowed to stay. If the rift reached here, they would have to deal with it. This wasn't the kind of work that could be done with the help of dragons or fairies. Sunset thought sadly that she had never been sent on a mission involving the rift either. Even presenting her lands at the ceremony was not something important to her. Moreover, the lady often tried to spoil the tasks entrusted to her in every possible way. Resting her head on the man's shoulder, Chris said that he too lived with passion, and it was wonderful. In a joyful voice, Axon Ark asked her to praise him again. The girl asked him why he needed her compliments. She added that he should receive them better from his lord. The man replied that he had no more important matters to attend to at the moment. The main rule was that if you do all your family duties first, the rest will be perfect. With a displeased expression, the girl noted that he was right. In a great mood, Axon Ark began to dream about the future with Chris. He asked where they would raise their future baby, already thinking about marriage and children. The girl just rolled her eyes in displeasure. After some time, the couple finally arrived at Krisarua's secret lair. The man gently lowered the girl to the ground, holding her hand. She assumed that they would get here much later. Axon Ark noted with delight that night had fallen and it was very beautiful outside. He added that the landscape was captivating in its charm. Looking at the smiling demon, Sunset realized that she had never told him the location of the lair. She began to think that he might have been secretly spying on her. The man turned to the girl and offered her a snack. She looked at him in surprise and asked if there was really anything to eat. Axon Ark informed her that if Krisarua wanted something now, she should not hesitate to speak up. Standing at the entrance to the lair, he solemnly announced that she was pregnant. Suddenly, a loud stomp was heard, and the atmosphere became ominous. Naskin came out of the darkness, hearing the demon's words. His eyes were burning with fury, reflecting uncontrollable anger, and there was a threat in his gaze. A cold sweat appeared on Sunset's face, and in a trembling voice she asked when the man had managed to get here. They had known each other since childhood, but she had never seen such a reaction to a person before. An enraged Naskin turned to the girl and asked who the guy who came with her was. She noted with relief that his memories had definitely been erased. Krisarua exchanged a glance with Axon Ark. She tried to convey a hint in her gaze that he should act as if they were strangers. The boy's smile clearly expressed his full understanding of the situation. It seemed that he had grasped the whole meaning of the hint without words. Seeing Axon's smiling face, Naskin's anger flared up again. That smug grin only made him more irritated. Sunset assumed his reaction was due to his childhood encounters with demons that attacked her. She felt like a war might break out between them. When Krisarua didn't respond, the man turned his gaze to the demon. With fury flashing in his golden eyes, he demanded to know who he was. The dark-skinned guy calmly gave his real name and mentioned that he was from the second lab. His expression remained completely unperturbed. Naskin confidently and menacingly began to approach Axon Ark. His steps were heavy, as if he intended to sweep away everything in his path. In a menacing voice, he demanded an explanation. Chris smiled uneasily, realizing that the conversation was heading in a dangerous direction. She realized that if it was not stopped, there could be big problems. The girl decided to take action and first turned to the demon. However, he made a fatal mistake by calling her Mistress Chris. Naskin exploded in rage, calling Axon Ark a devil's spawn. His eyes blazed with madness and his voice cut through the tense silence like it was tearing the air apart. The man coldly demanded that the boy repeat his words. Zakatnitsa was overcome with horror, feeling the atmosphere become tense. At that moment, it became clear that the situation was completely out of control. Clenching his fists, Naskin asked where this guy had the courage to address Lady Krisarua as if they were close. The girl felt goosebumps run across her skin. Holding her breath, Sunset spoke tensely to the demon, ordering him to return home. She promised that she would explain everything to the man herself. Chris confidently said that even if Axon Ark spoke to him, there would definitely be no dialogue. The guy grinned and wished the lady to be careful. Naskin snorted in irritation and looked away. Sunset gently touched his torso, inviting him into her lair, as this was no place for serious conversation. The girl suddenly felt a wave of nausea and tried to pronounce the man's name, but her voice wavered. Exhausted, she leaned against him, searching for support. Her breathing was ragged, her legs were buckling. Naskin asked with concern in his voice if Chrysarua was really pregnant. She looked down and sighed slightly, then nodded softly, confirming his words. Not believing his ears, the man asked her several times if she was really going to have a baby. With a slight irritation in her voice, Chris confirmed that it was. Her words sounded confident and final. Then Naskin began to ask if she had become pregnant from that demon. The girl, clutching her head tiredly, closed her eyes, as if trying to cope with the growing tension. Sunset screamed sharply, answering that she did not know, and her voice trembled with despair. Seeing the man's surprised eyes, she repeated the answer even louder, emphasizing her confusion. With a hopeless expression on his face, he began asking stupid questions, asking why she hadn't told him about it. Chris tried to stop him, but he continued to mumble, not stopping. Naskin suddenly grabbed the girl by the shoulders, continuing to pester her with questions. His eyes were blazing with worry. He asked how she felt, constantly talking about the gigantic strain on her body. The man sighed, gently lifting Chrysarua into his arms. She didn't object but simply lowered her eyes tiredly, allowing him to hold her carefully. As she walked inside, Sunset kept her eyes on the night sky. She wondered if this was really that important to Naskin. Her mind was filled with doubts and thoughts. Naskin quickly put Chris to bed, carefully covering her with a white blanket. He then decided to ask if their mistress knew about the situation. The girl shook her head, explaining that the woman would be very upset. She silently thought about how she would not be able to tell about the incident with the 3 men and the subsequent pregnancy. The lady's reaction immediately popped into her head. Referring to the fairies, she couldn't believe how these scoundrels dared to cross the line. Covering her face with her hand in alarm, she asked who dared to touch Chrysarua. If the woman had learned of the demon's complicity, she would have concluded that the underworld needed to be wiped off the map. Before that, she had naively thought that demons only communicated with each other, not having dealings with others. If the lady heard about a third party in the incident, she would be furious. Chrysarua thought that was exactly what would happen if she found out about what had happened. Unable to calm down completely, Naskin continued to pour out angry words about the father of the girl's child. She looked at him with frightened, worried eyes. Swallowing hard, Sunset quietly asked the man to calm down. He frowned and asked bitterly how he could remain calm when she had almost died. The statement that Chrysarua could die left her in shock. Meeting her stunned gaze, Naskin anxiously explained that it took a huge amount of mana to create the child. The man exhaled heavily and added that the girl was no ordinary dragon. He explained that it was her pregnancy that was the cause of her severe dizziness and nausea. He looked down and asked if that was why she had asked for help with the ceremony. Naskin clenched his fists and said that if Chris was really having a baby, it was a miracle she was still standing. The man realized that being so busy with research and other things, Sunset was unable to eat properly. In addition, her child was now very weak. Feeling deeply guilty, the girl shyly pulled the blanket even tighter around her. Awkwardly, almost in a whisper, she explained that she truly hadn't realized how powerful the mana was. Naskin said that Chrysarua was a dusk dragon, and she didn't get close to anyone. No one knew that such a situation could happen. He tiredly ran his hand over his forehead, ruffling his hair. The man sighed heavily and noted that Sunset had had to shake off the symptoms when they first appeared. He asked how long she had been pregnant. Confused by the question, she covered her mouth with her hand. Not wanting to put psychological pressure on the girl, Naskin told her not to answer the question. He noted that the risk of death still existed, and asked if the boy knew what kind of dragon she was. Chris didn't answer, looking down. The man frowned murderously and declared that this scoundrel was now the enemy of all dragons. The man did not know who he was, but he promised her to turn the lower world, the lands of the spirits of nature and the lands of the gods, upside down. He swore to find him and tear him to shreds. The girl looked at the man in confusion, realizing that he was the criminal. Her eyes, full of hopelessness, met his passionate gaze. Sunset now understood why the lady and the other dragons had asked if she had a lover. She noted with satisfaction that she had not even thought of such a thing. Looking at Naskin's dejected expression, Chrysarua decided to change the subject. Standing up, she asked in a displeased tone if he had really been preparing for the ceremony while sitting there. The man asked if it was that important now. The girl replied that it was of the utmost importance at the moment. Ignoring her words, he raised his head and declared that he had decided something. Sunset asked warily what exactly was being discussed. Naskin, without hiding his solemnity, suddenly announced that he would take responsibility for this child. The man added that he had been racking his brains all night and realized what Chrysaorua was thinking. He believed that she was choosing with whom to share this honor. The girl wondered how far he had gone in his thoughts. Dragons usually had a child alone. The reason was that they formed the womb by absorbing other tribes. That is why they did not want to share such an honor with others. Because of this, dragons often had only one mother. In special cases, some chose a partner, but this happened very rarely. Chris suggested that perhaps they thought that by getting close to someone who didn't know about the condition and getting pregnant, they could get rid of them. It was a way to avoid the consequences. Suddenly, Naskin looked warmly at Sunset. He asked if she remembered their first meeting. She asked warily what he meant. The man said that the girl had been weak since childhood. Therefore, the lady, concerned about this, ordered him to look after her. She asked, puzzled, what time he was talking about. Naskin reminded her that there had been a protracted war with the demons back then, and Chris thought about it. She had almost died at their hands several times during those times. He had really been through a lot and suffered a lot, protecting her. The man had been quite harsh at the time, but now he had become softer. Looking closely at the girl, he noted that although they were the same age when they first met, he had thought she was much younger. Naskin thought that Sunset could die from his touch alone. These were the thoughts he had then. He lived only for her and protected her so that no one could harm her. The man noticed that the current situation was not much different from the previous one. Suddenly blushing, the girl did not understand why his gaze had been so shy since the morning. Naskin spoke softly to Chrysaorua, gently touching her smooth palm. He asked if it would be hard for her if her mana was insufficient. Looking Sunset straight in the eyes, the boy noted that she knew everything. He was sure of it from the very beginning. Chris could only listen to his words, stunned. The man said he would help her replenish her mana and find a partner, confident in his choice. She tried to scold him, adding that he was not interested in the affairs of the gods and was only having fun. Naskin wondered in surprise if that was a problem. Sunset nodded confidently. She asked when he was going to come to his senses, since the lady was very worried about him. The boy couldn't help but chuckle and say that it didn't bother him at all. Chrysaorua was stunned, not understanding how this had happened, and tried to scold him again, but he interrupted her. Sunset stared at the man's slightly exposed collarbones, her gaze focused. He grinned and turned to her with a promise that there would be no more problems. With a sparkle in his eyes, Naskin added that he would help completely forget this unknown scum. His face showed courage, as if he was ready to fight any difficulties for the sake of his dear Chris. Then the man turned to the girl. He said that if she did not object, she would consider this child hers. His voice was full of determination and care, which emphasized the seriousness of his intentions. Sunset was silent for a few seconds, deep in thought. She looked down as if searching for an answer, and her eyes were lost in the half-tones. Raising her head uncertainly, Chrysaorua wondered if it would have been better to get rid of the child if he was a threat to her life. The thought tormented her, and she struggled with her own fears and doubts. Naskin asked in a serious tone if the girl really wanted this. Chrysaorua was lost in thought again, her thoughts becoming even darker and more confused. If she had a child, mana absorption or selection of a partner with better qualities would become the norm. However, even if she searched thoroughly, the probability of failure was still high. After some time of reflection, the girl said that she did not want to get rid of the child. The man suggested the option of selection, but she replied that she needed to think more. Nodding in approval, Naskin decided to ask if he needed to conduct the ceremony properly first. Chrysaorua, hesitating a bit, replied that yes, it was necessary. Rising to his feet, the man declared that he would then prepare himself thoroughly, as Sunset had desired. He offered her something to eat, noting that he would look for it on the way. The girl frowned slightly and asked him to stop and wait. She added that she had an important question for him. Sunset clutched the blanket tightly as if seeking support in it. She cleared her throat, gathering her thoughts. Chrysaorua asked if she could gain his mana, if she could use the power of the Dawn Dragons like he did. She wondered if she could even feel that incredible power for a moment. Looking at Chris closely, Naskin asked why she needed it if she had him. She responded a little indignantly, asking how he could command the powers of the Dawn Dragons so easily. The man added that he had promised, and asked if there was anything else she had failed to do. After thinking for a moment, he said that her theory had a right to exist. Chris was shocked and did not immediately believe his words. She froze in place, clearly doubting their veracity, and tried to comprehend what she heard. Naskin explained that mana had a certain flow. If it was not suitable for the body, serious problems could occur. An error in this process could lead to death. Smiling, the man told her to contact him if the girl needed a fortune. He added that he was always happy to help with any question. They said goodbye warmly, waving to each other. Naskin nodded slightly and headed towards the exit, leaving the girl lost in thought. Chrysarua looked down, puzzled. If she had seen the future by borrowing the power of the Dawn Dragons, then things were about to get a lot more complicated. The problem was that the future they saw could not be changed. Sunset recalled disturbing memories that made her even more anxious. The day of the festival had arrived, which meant that the ancestor worship ceremony was about to take place. The buildings in the center were decorated with brightly colored flags fluttering in the wind. The celebration had already begun, but Chrysarua did not even remember her last days. She moved tiredly along the street. Her steps were slow and heavy. There were more Rift-related quests this year, which explained why there were far fewer people this time than last. The ceremony was the first of the festival, and then all that was left was to eat and have fun. The girl enthusiastically promised herself that today she would definitely rest and enjoy the holiday. Suddenly, Sunset heard familiar voices behind her. A group of guys greeted her in a friendly manner. Turning around, Chris realized that they were skilled trainees, aspiring to become guards. She noticed that they were awkward and looked a little embarrassed. One of them, standing in the middle, asked if they could discuss a recent incident. Smiling awkwardly, the girl was surprised that they got straight to the point. When they met again, Chrysarua realized that they were very young fairies. Even a minor punishment could affect their fates and become a great burden. If they are deemed useless and cut off as useless branches, they will not be able to receive the blessing of their parent tree and will be discarded. This is something no Fae would want to understand. Since that was the case, Sunset thought the boys could do her a small favor. She crossed her hands angrily and asked if they would think about their actions. They nodded guiltily. The girl frowned and said that this time she would turn a blind eye to what had happened. Then she decided to warn that next time she would not be so lenient. With tears in their eyes, the group of boys began to thank the lady. In a serious tone, she suddenly turned to them and asked if they could accompany her to the land of the spirits of nature. This request greatly surprised them. One of them explained that it was impossible since they were interns. He asked if she had looked at their IDs that time. Chris thought with annoyance that it wasn't a refusal, and they really couldn't help. However, in reality, she didn't have high expectations to begin with. After thinking for a moment, the girl asked if they would be able to support someone if she ever asked them to take sides. They nodded confidently in response. Sunset decided to be more specific and asked if it would be like that even with a demon. The boys, their mouths slightly open, decided to consult. A group of fairies began a conversation, assuming that the lady was trying to reconcile them. They were all irritated by Axe and Arc, but none wanted to return to the old parent tree. Sunset clasped her hands together and noted that she had heard everything. If anyone found out about their misdeed, they would be punished in the lands of the nature spirits. Having come to a mutual conclusion, the group of fairies stated that they could take sides once. With a smirk, Chrysarua asked if they could swear before the parent tree. The boys were puzzled as to how they could do such a thing. The girl did not understand why it was so difficult, since they would soon become official guardsmen. The fairies looked at each other again and said that this conversation was embarrassing to them. They did not intend to continue the discussion of this topic. Looking at Sunset, they explained that their platoon was the lowest ranked of the 12 units. They were the only trainees who had not been assigned a mission involving the rift. The boys added sullenly that they would probably have to return to the lands of the nature spirits this year. Chris's eyes were wide open, and she couldn't understand how that was possible. The girl was misled by the fact that in her dream they had the insignia of the Scaled Guard. She decided that it really was just a dream and sighed with relief. Suddenly, an idea came to Sunset's mind. Raising her index finger, she suggested hiring those 3 guys. The group of fairies gaped at the unexpected proposal. After a short pause, one of them asked how exactly Lady Crisarua planned to use them. The girl said that if they couldn't work in the Mother Tree Guard, they should work for her. With her resources, she could easily feed their entire platoon. The boys began whispering again, saying that Sunset had overestimated them. One of them admitted that he had come here with the goal of achieving success by mindlessly waving his weapon. But in the end, he had failed. The group of fairies gradually became more and more interested in the offer, wanting to receive a steady salary. Chris stood awkwardly to the side, silently listening to the entire conversation. The boys continued to discuss a certain old incident involving the Lord of the Lands of the Gods without stopping. After some time, they came to the conclusion that they needed to confer again. Crisarua nodded reservedly. She asked them to promise that they would either side with her or her friend. The blondes nodded confidently, their eyes sparkling. As she watched the boys leave, she realized that their hostility towards Axanarch was not a problem, because they were stupid. She decided that he was a high-ranking demon enough to live in sedition without fear. Suddenly a bell rang. Sunset turned towards the sound, her long silky hair fluttering in the wind, and a drop of amazement froze on her face. A large crowd of people had gathered in the square, waiting for the ancestor worship ceremony to begin. There was a thrill of excitement in the air, and finally the long-awaited celebration began. Once upon a time, an eternal war was unleashed. It was caused by the desire to single-handedly control the power of God and the desire to seize world power. However, a great disaster occurred, the Rift, which split this world. To stop it, the three clans stopped fighting and divided their forces. The Dragon Clan received powerful magic and the power of destruction. The fairies received the power of immutability and inexhaustible life energy. The demons received the power of preservation and the wisdom of the world. Thus, the three clans that possessed the Mila decided to disperse to their own lands. From that moment on, they never stopped collaborating to try to close the rift. In addition to remember their oath, the clans founded sedition. Every year, a ceremony was held in the center of the city that simplified the ancient history. The man raised a long trumpet to his lips and blew into it, creating a deep, resonant sound. In response to this signal, a blue fire flared up, symbolizing the clan of fairies. Following him, a purple fire lit up the air, emitting a mysterious glow. It represented the Demon Clan, adding solemnity to the ceremony. Then the central tower was illuminated with a bright golden fire, symbolizing the Dragon Clan. This fire flowed into the sky, creating a mesmerizing and majestic light. Naskin walked down the road with a concentrated expression, activating the yellow fire in his hand. His snow-white robe with gilded edges gave him a majestic appearance. Naskin approached the center of the stage and directed his beam of power straight into the sky. A bright stream of light shot upward, creating a clear and powerful light trail. The higher the beam rose, the wider it expanded until it touched the heavens. Eventually, it created a huge yellow glow, like a sea of light, spreading across the sky. Crisarua sat peacefully on the bench enjoying a pink lollipop. With genuine amazement in her eyes, she couldn't tear her gaze away from what was happening in front of her. As she watched the ceremony with rapt attention, the girl wondered how long it would take her to restore her mana if she were in his place. This question only increased her interest in the event. Realizing that no restorative medicine could compare to his abilities, Sunset felt a slight sadness. Regret flickered in her golden eyes. Chris had asked him to do this herself, but she couldn't avoid the sad thoughts. She continued to watch as Naskin began to read his words, which flowed like music. Sol Noctis approached him slowly and confidently, a diadem glittering on his head. In a monotonous voice, he began to read his part of the spell. Sunset was a little worried about the effects of the medicine, but everything turned out to be fine. The yellow glow smoothly turned into other colors, mesmerizing the audience. There were two fairies standing next to the girl. One of them praised Sol Noctis's efforts, but the other pointed out his poor origins. Chris noted with irritation that the perfectionist could not be wrong. Crisarua wondered who was representing the Demon Clan this year. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice and a third man walked onto the stage. Stunned by surprise, Sunset jumped to her feet and screamed loudly. The guy standing next to her jumped so much in surprise that his shoulders jerked and fear flashed in his eyes. The third mediator was Axanarch. He held a purple flame in his hand as he chanted majestically. Unlike the others, his all-black attire made him stand out from the others. The girl could hardly believe her eyes. Axe and Arc turned out to be a representative of the demons. She could not even imagine that their paths would cross again, and in such an unexpected place. Turning towards the voice, the man immediately spotted Mrs. Crisarua among the crowd. Without a trace of excitement, he cheerfully waved his hand at her and smiled broadly, as if this was the most ordinary meeting. Sunset's eyes and mouth were wide open in shock. She sat there stunned and motionless like a stone statue unable to move. The girl did not understand how the person who recreated historical events could pay attention to the audience. It seemed to her that he had decided to simply ruin the ceremony. Trying to remedy the situation, Crisarua began to jump and hop, pointing upward and hinting for him to focus. But the man continued to look at her, ignoring her actions and calls. Suddenly, the beam of light directed towards the sky began to shine powerfully with purple light. Its dazzling beauty made Sunset even more angry, because the demon was really good. Then the girl fell on all fours, amazed, looking sadly at the floor. She realized that she had only wasted her own strength. The guy standing next to her did not understand what had happened to her. Gathering her strength, Crisarua stood up and sat back down on the bench. She sighed heavily, thinking that if she had been in the men's place, she would have gone mad with embarrassment. Sunset looked down and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear sadly. Looking up, she thought that she could never create such powerful magic. The girl leaned back and folded her arms in displeasure. Naskin's introduction was perfect, and Axe and Arc did a great job. Sol Noctis should do the rest of the job well too. Suddenly, Crisarua felt a strange sensation. She thought she heard an unknown voice, and she thought she was hallucinating. Then the girl noticed two fairies nearby, who were standing tensely and did not understand what had happened. She realized that everyone had heard the strange voice. Sunset looked at the scene and noticed Sol Noctis's drooping figure. She immediately knew that something was wrong with him. One of the boys suggested that the man forgot his lines. They both disliked Noctis, but the second called him crazy, saying that it was impossible. Participation in the ceremony was extremely important for the fairies. The boys thought that the mediator would receive a severe punishment for damaging the honor of the family tree. While silently listening to the conversations, Crisarua continued to watch Sol Noctis with excitement. His face was full of anxiety and bewilderment. His eyes were wide open, his eyebrows were raised, and his lips were trembling slightly. The girl was in deep shock. Even if the man had really lost his memory, it was unacceptable for the situation to continue in the same spirit and caused great anxiety. Sunset thought it was her potion. Alarmed, she clenched her fists tightly. Her hands began to tremble. The delicate skin on her fingers turned white from the strain. Suddenly, a cracking sound came from the sky, and a small black crack appeared in it. Naskin narrowed his eyes in displeasure, not understanding why Sol Noctis froze. Hearing the strange sound, the men raised their heads and looked at the sky. Not believing what they saw, their brows slightly furrowed, and their eyes widened in surprise. Thinking about what had happened and coming to her senses, the girl could not understand what everyone was looking at so intently. Looking carefully at the people around her, she also raised her head. Looking up at the sky, Crisarua noticed a familiar formation. It was a rift. The dark crack stood out sharply against the background, giving her an uneasy feeling. Sunset couldn't believe that he was already in the sacred territory of sedition. The hole continued to gradually increase in size, and its edges began to turn black. The rift was rapidly expanding across the sky, filling the space with a terrifying roar. Crisarua couldn't understand why the others were standing still. It seemed to her that no one had heard the crack. Immediately, Naskin leaned slightly, concentrating all his power into his hand. Yellow light emitted from his palm, filling the surrounding area with a bright glow and creating a powerful luminescence. The man straightened up and aimed the beam at the rift. His palm glowed with bright light, filling everything around him with a blinding radiance. His other hand was tensely clenched into a fist. People looked at Naskin's magic with admiration. His every move was a delight. His magical power was mesmerizing and evoked astonished cries. It seemed that nature itself obeyed his will. A few seconds later, the menacing rift disappeared. To the sound of applause, the man headed toward a small table where 3 glasses stood. The other clan representatives approached the table, picked up glasses and clinked them solemnly. Sol Noctis, standing next to him with his head down, looked depressed and exhausted. Sunset watched the whole thing, then looked down sadly. People around her were commenting on how quickly the ceremony had ended, glad to have the chance to enjoy the festival longer. There was only one way to close the rift: seal the hole with powerful magic. Naskin did it before the audience noticed. Chris clenched her fists in frustration, believing that the Dusk Dragons were not capable of doing this. The crowd continued to cheer enthusiastically about the feat of the Dragon Dawn. They began to speculate that he could become the next Lord of the God Clan. The finale of the celebration was truly impressive. Thanks to the proactive actions of the hero of all times, the ceremony of honoring the ancestors ended quickly. It was the shortest of all such events in history. From this moment on, the real festival began, when one could have a lot of fun. However, the girl was haunted by one disturbing thought. She was really worried about Sol Noctis. The mistake in the ceremony was caused by the man's medicine. If Chris had known about the consequences, she would not have used it and would have simply talked. Although she did not treat him thoughtlessly. Sunset had overdosed twice. Naturally, under such circumstances, there would have been a side effect. At that moment, she had acted too carelessly. The girl wanted to find Sol Noctis and talk to him. She looked around the area in hopes of seeing him. Suddenly, 3 familiar fairies approached Crisarua from behind. They greeted her, holding a lot of delicious snacks in their hands. Crisarua jumped in surprise, involuntarily screaming. She asked why they were following her. The boys pointed out her hasty steps and suggested that she had something interesting. With a puzzled expression, the girl could not understand what they were talking about. One of the fairies suggested that Dusk had escaped through the rift. Crisarua, her mouth hanging open in surprise, asked if they had seen it. The blondes nodded, noting how well the Dawn Dragon had handled it. Although the fairies were lowly in rank, they were attentive, which struck the girl as unusual. She explained that she was in no hurry because of the rift, and suggested that they come with her since they were already there. The boys were discussing how if the humans weren't blind, they should have noticed the rift. One of them kept talking about the feat of the Dawn Dragon. Then Chris pointed at someone. Sol Noctis stood in the square, dejected, under the report of 2 fairies. They did not understand how he dared to take on the responsibility of representing the parent tree and conduct the ceremony in such a way. They kept saying that they shouldn't have trusted the one from the withered branches. It seemed like every word they said was destroying Noctis's soul more and more. The men frowned even more and said that disciplinary measures had to be taken. Crisarua realized that these were the high-ranking fairies she disliked most. Sunset remembered that she had originally planned to use the blondes if Axanarch was in a dispute again. She then turned to them and said that it was time to fulfill the dispute. To the girl's surprise, the group of guys didn't even look at her. She began to think that they weren't going to help her in this situation. Crisarua frowned, pursing her lips. She realized that the fairies were going to take this chance to humiliate Sol Noctis. She thought about taking charge of his business with the rift. Sunset stood up tensely, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, a group of boys tried to intervene. One of them said that these were the men who were encroaching on the authority of the parent tree. The second added that they had no right to punish him, and should have waited for the official verdict. The third folded his arms in displeasure and nodded. The girl only opened her mouth in amazement. The high-ranking fairy asked who they were, assuming they were victims number 2. He added that the group of boys were covering for the man who had caused the rift to appear in the sacred area. The long-haired blonde asked if it was really because of him. He smirked and noted that only these men knew the reason for the cleft. The guy suggested writing an article, because they knew everything perfectly well. He noted that high-ranking fairies could thus become allies of the parent tree. The other blonde began using almost insults, trying to get the fairies mad. His words became more and more harsh, but they were already at their limit, barely holding back their emotions. Crisarua stood in complete shock, not believing her eyes. She thought about how her comrades had no shame at all for their actions. The high-ranking fairy stated that in any case, everyone saw how Sol Noctis failed in the second part. Accordingly, he should receive a severe punishment. The second man added that the group of boys should be more careful in their actions. He also told them to wait for an official decision. Stepping back a bit, the blonde asked Sunset if it was enough. Smiling awkwardly, she assured him that they had really tried hard. Finally, Crisarua sincerely thanked the fairies, calling them the best. Her words literally made them shine. Their faces lit up with joy and pride. After a short silence, the boys turned to the lady and asked if they could visit her lair anytime soon. They wanted to discuss her recent offer to accompany them to the lands of the spirits of nature. The girl smiled and told them to come any time. The group of fairies thanked her and then said goodbye and wished them to enjoy the festival. Sunset turned away, her face serious. It was good that those guys were gone because she urgently needed to talk to Sol Noctis about punishment. Chrysaorua looked at the man's face and her heart sank. It was downcast with deep despair in his eyes, reflecting deep inner torment and profound experiences.